Okay, so Tamir just ended with, we are in the air. So Tamir just ended with this, the beginning of our panel, because we'll be talking about the internal arena, of course, and Manu did open with, and presented various changes we're going through, and I think the very fact that there are rifts in Israeli society and tension and friction, there's nothing new about that. We have the very famous speech on the tribes of President Rivlin. I remember that the annual assessment on the internal arena was in charge of the chapter that talks about the tension between the democratic and the Jewish state, and the national values and religious values, and democratic and liberal values, and what is the future holds for us. And in the Institute, we did publish the existential threats of the state of Israel. So there was the Iranian threat and precision-guided weapons and etc. And I was in charge of the internal threats, again, about the rifts, even the civil war scenario that was there at the low probability. But obviously, as we said, we know that the problem exists, but we're not really sure. We see that during the last years, we see an outbreak of all of those concerns and the threats that we thought will be quite distant. They all look a little more tangible, in fact, and threatening and close. And we'll talk about that during this panel. So again, this whole audience already knows what we're talking about. It does start with the government that was elected. That is a full right-wing government with Benjamin Netanyahu as the left wing as symbol, which was already then quite concerning, but already had governments from different directions, and there's a little bit of an undermining of the whole concept. The moment the government is being elected, it will be actually preoccupying itself with the concerns of the whole nation, but not just those who voted for them, their constituents. I think the next move of the government of the charging with full throttle and full force upon the move of the judiciary overhaul that began from the place of criticism upon the too high level of the judiciary activism and the appointment of the justices by recommendation of other judges. Criticism that at a certain point one can actually say is not completely outrageous. Significant part of this criticism is irrelevant and ignoring changes that already occurred, but then certain criticism in the field of security where this court actually facilitates and actually helps the security forces. But this particular aspect of judicial criticism, the solution that was suggested was to amend the lack of balance that they claimed exists while creating a complete disbalance towards the other direction, but all the powers in the hands of the government to appoint the judges and to restrict the ability of the court to restrict the government, while we know that the parliament has no ability to restrict the government, in fact. So there was a bit of a concern that emerged that brought people to the streets. We're concerned for the future of the democratic regime, whether we'll find ourselves in this situation where we won't be able to replace this government. That's what drew people to the streets. But we see a shift that brings me back to the beginning of what I just said. Suddenly it brought up all the rifts. When you look at this government with a certain very high level of concerns, what it actually represents, the coalition agreements and various statements concerning the future of our society as a liberal society, and where the values and the check and balances. At the background of this particular concern, we all familiar with the significant level of protest, and the protest continues and carries on and does not erode. There are different attempts of reaching a compromise. The question, where will it lead? And on this particular background, we are trying in this panel to address two stages. What exactly is happening here? What are the dangers of the current state of affairs? Some of them were addressed in the previous panels, but we'll talk inwards. And secondly, and hopefully we'll hear from the panelist members whether we can emerge from this crisis and how. We will begin with the political arena, and here we have the expert, the senior researcher of the Institute, the former parliament member Ofer Shelah, that for years was the leading parliament member. And the question to you, sir, is a very simple one. Actually, a simple question to you, sir. First of all, what is behind this particular chapter following the continuation of the overhaul and the parliament and the budgetary discussions versus the promotion of the overhaul? What is happening? What will happen around the negotiations at the president? and to what extent the opposition is connected or influences the protest, how in fact that is when there will be maybe there will be some kind of compromise. And before you do that, say a word about what might happen now during the next few days of the Memorial Day and the Independence Day. Will it impact somehow what is happening right now?
The problem is that the questions is I don't know what will happen in the following days. We all know where it comes from. By that, I don't think that that it only comes out only now, that the service, the military service, or the morning is the card that is on this identity discussion. Is that from today? It's not for the last years. It has been for a long time in the here about as it happened with the military survey, with the threat of the reserve, not to get to the reserve, and it may happen with the obligatory recruitment that would happen with the laws of the recruitment of soldiers. We got to a point that from the moment that the stone took over, this Pandora box was opened and the devils came out, all the devils come out, and now this issue also what was considered like basic ideals and sacred values like the mourning or the military service of the Israeli society, which are a value issue. It's outside that we cannot put it into the box. Some other things that happened lately. It's hard. It is hard for those among us who, for them, this member state is personally important, and of course for those who have lost that we both of them would think that data should have been out of any dispute, but it is irreversible. If they will.
If we'll succeed to survive that peacefully, will it help us to calm down? I'm not sure what peaceful means.
I don't know what they're going to peace with it. The two ministers have said that they will not come to the cemeteries from the Yadut Torah with a religious party. The problem is that, by the way, it is clear. We were representatives of the country on those days when we were members of the Knesset. When a representative of the country, state is arrived, that people who think this way or that way, they're in the cemetery. And of course, for them, these people, the presence of certain ministers is unbearable, and for other, these people out there is unbearable. And this is outside. This is here. This is on the table. We cannot return from that. There's no way to get back. I don't think that. And I want to take it to the general level. The political system is irrelevant and had not been born today. It is irrelevant. It happens all over the world, in different countries. I think the political systems are less able to confront with the problems that people are dealing with, but we'll leave it as a general remark. And the political system is trying to run after the tail that what's happening out there, mainly in the opposition. I think that will happen. And I am in contact with people who are discussing this issue. There's nothing that will get to in the president, how that will calm down their protests. So the chance is very minimal to get to a compromise. If you want to say, I will explain what can we get to, but I'm saying that the achievement, the maximal achievement that can we expect from the government and the coalition in this situation is that they will now go back and to neutralize the two components that were the most essential that made the protest effective. Let's admit this is not 150,000 people. It doesn't matter how many people are going to the streets. They gave a legitimation for two things that have never been so strong, and the security and the economical issues that bring to the end the stopping of the legislation, and has touched upon and only on the story of Gallant, but they're very strong threats that the security is in danger. He didn't say against the legislation that was a reform, but they're very that the leaders of the security in Israel have told him about these threats, and the damage, the economical damage, unfortunately the government didn't do anything to amend it, and we get data that we get out today. But the statements are very, very clear, and the signs of the money is escaping from the countries that are the companies that are registering in the country, and the investment that are lessening. I think the maximal achievement that we can expect from the point of the government, of all of them, that the different entities, the different factors, after day one, after the Gallant was resigned, was taken out of his office, the Histadrut has given a general strike. They will not calm down the protestation, but the protestation is something very strong and deep, that and it's not governed by anybody, and not only the falling down of the government, but the basic change of the Israel, a fundamental change of the Israeli society. Can call it maybe a different positioning of the different political factors, and this will not stop. And there is no. I understand what Tamir said. I accept his. It's not only the inner problem. I don't take, but Israel can challenge every challenges. But the situation is now there's no leadership, political leadership. It is close to discourse that stopped that, and it will happen. What happened, whatever happened.
So let's continue with the threats, and let's move to you, Idit. Dr. Idit Shafan-Gittelman is senior researcher in the Institute. You researched for many years the topic of society and the military. Let's talk about the threat that Ofer mentioned of the falling apart of various security services, such as an IDF as well. How would you assess, to what extent really this falling apart, the threat of falling apart, is actually tangible? What can prevent it? So I would take a risk, and I will argue with Ofer, which is something I usually try to avoid. And I think that, in fact, everything that will emerge from the president's dialogue, we can say that the process has a certain sentiment that will go for at least of the removal of the government. But I think that the forces that aid them significantly, the protests of the reservists, for example, they will not be siding with such a purpose, and without the reservists protest, it's quite interesting to see what will be the impact of the protest. I don't think it will be actually of the same scope that it existed before the overhaul stopped. If there will be any kind of consent reached, I have obviously I will not argue with that, but no, this is not the question. Well, when we talk about the impact in the military, again, we need to distinguish between two different types of impact. There is a direct impact that, as often said, obviously, and that would cause all of those warnings of the falling apart of the military and the protest. Just 1 second, we have a technical difficulty with the internet. And the scope of the protest, wherever it touches the capacity of the IDF to handle the threats, the threat of the reservists, and the whole preoccupation that is provoked and required from the heads of the system. And if you remember, the previous panels mentioned that in all of the arenas, significant level of attention has been addressed to this particular aspect. But there is also a lateral impact, and a more dangerous one, which is actually the dragging of the military into the political space, and it doesn't matter how the military will be conducting itself within this space. The price tag will be tremendous, and we talked about rifts and the direct impact. I think it's even more than how the IDF will be handling the lack of reservists arriving to the drills. The sentiments of the first Israel and the second Israel rift that is currently emerging, well, taking the military hostage into this political space, I think it created even more problems for the military than the very fact of the refusal of reservists. That was maybe even an imaginary one. Let's talk about the protest of the pilots. This imaginary tension between the technical assistant department and the pilots. Someone wanted to emphasize this problem that did not exist, and now the reservists return to serve at reservist duty. All the previous panels talk about the ability to handle the attacks. Obviously, in advance, they said that for the operational activity, they will be arriving. But this problem has been solved. But the tension and the gaps, the sense of discomfort between the different parties in the military remained. Now, when we look at the military into political space in the world, we would never imagine the realms. The Division 51, there was discipline events that happened many before the protests and many will happen in continuation. 10 minutes went by before they published the event and then social networks were someone received a refusal among the pilots. Now they're seeing the refusal of the Golani Brigade. Okay, obviously, as the commanders of the military, what are we going to do with the disciplinary action? Whatever they will be doing, they will be politically biased, whether it will be a harsh treatment. You can see the pilots, we contain them, but the Golani soldiers are being hardly disciplined. And the Brig containing what actually happened. Look at that, and all the social networks were actually bubbling. Well, this is too light of the punishment, and look at the pilots, that's because of them. Again, one can understand what the motivation of those different agencies to do that, but one cannot really exaggerate to what extent this is a dangerous tendency for the military. I think more than some kind of immediate ramifications. So basically, Ariel Heimann, who is the PhD and the Brigadier General and the senior researcher, he was also the chief reservist officer in the past. Maybe a little bit, let's get into the topic of reservist service. And later on, I would love to hear about the rest of the forces of security, such as police and etc. Reservist force. To what extent are you afraid that the compromise in the presidential dialogue will decrease this threat, or is it already irrelevant? To what extent, in fact, the threat is actually real, or is it just completely exaggerated in comparison to the actual occurrences?
What has been said? What has been said? And it is really was realized, לא שומעים אותו. את שומעת אותו?
לא.
לא שומעים אותו. המיקרופון שלו לא דלוק לדעתי. There was a short test. נקטע. לא שומעים אותו. In addition to that, briefly, the reserve is a small test. It really withstood but the protest didn't stop. And the reserve soldiers still interrupted. But what I know, what I hear, נקטע, לא עובד, כלום. And if there will be a legislation in a, it will difficult to take place of event. A very good leader in Quor, but he's less of a big expert in the social issues in the within the Israeli society. The political playground made a mistake, and it lessens its problem to. As Ofer said, there's a very strong devil that was somehow, with silence in the bottle, an informal agreement came out, burst out big, and it will create immense protest. So let's talk.
So let's talk a little bit about the recruitment law, because the ultra-Orthodox are not being drafted. Well, whether it's audacity or not, but if you want to solve and to legislate on this matter of the recruitment law, of the draft, do you think that the law, the draft will create a crisis? What's your opinion about the draft law? How can we actually solve this problem, to your opinion?
I mean, my eyes, if no, part of what has to be two things only. The one thing, some kind of a definition. The coalition will not have a majority in choosing the judges. So for that purpose, get back when we organize the justice that but retreating at this point from all the legislation that they wanted to do, but and for the judges, the different proposal, you know even better than I do. But whatever will happen, but the end, the public is, if the coalition can put judges by its own decision, and next to it is the enrollment of soldiers. There has to be a law for the enrollment of soldiers, otherwise we are in trouble. But this law has to be such. And there are different proposals of the table. The proposal of Lieberman, or in my opinion, is not a good one. This very bad proposal, because the that we have put on the table in the point of view of the alternative service to the military service, that will solve other problems, but also in the model that will been suggested by the IDF, that we support, to making the service shorter and the differentials military service. They put it. לא שומעים כלום. כלום. מה?
אתה שומע אותו? לא, רגע, אבל עכשיו פה יצא מהזה. ממבלינג. תוציא את זה. So, as we said during the previous panels, what one has to do, what has to be done today in order for us to create some kind of an exit from this crisis, in order to return into our balance that is more convenient that existed here before. What we need to do in order to reach some kind of chance of exiting from this crisis. So first of all, I would like to say that the way the protest has never been actually led by some kind of force. If there is a chance or any hope on the young generation, in fact, I think we need to listen to what Orna just said. I completely agree. We are here in order to create a new social contract. I don't have, obviously, high expectations from the current government, but I do think that what we do not talk about right now, and we need to see what we do in a context. So this law, the conscription law, and the increase of the pensions paid to those who study Torah. Obviously, until now, they persuaded us that exempting them from service, they will be joining the employment market, but this is not happening, and that's why the protest is not calming down. Again, we aspire towards the equality, and we can't accept such a situation. Okay, again. And we need to maybe give an advice, and it's very convenient for me to talk about the military. The military has to understand that it's a civic process. They speak a different language, and they need to conduct themselves in a way that is... אבל מה, אני לא יודעת, תעזרו לי, אני לא מומחית לזה. אתה רוצה שלעזור לי? אוקיי. Just a second. אוקיי, אני לא מבינה. לא שומעים? So when it comes to the external threats, the military knows how to do that. But how you conduct yourself in the world that is almost completely civic, and you have to know that the rules of the game are different. Ariel. I will use one word that may be a bit of a way out to describe the current state of affairs for all of the parties, and this is governance. Try to, and it's very difficult to do that because indeed some of the protesters say, you know what, all the rules were completely broken and we will never give you up until we'll rearrange and reach a new order. They have to understand that there are the things that are currently on the agenda, for example, the security situation of Israel, and they have to be very government-oriented. The government has to understand that in some places they need to be very statehood-oriented. A joint letter, which is a sign of it, the joint letter of Netanyahu and the others for the Remembrance Day. So statehoodness is something we need to look for. People that represent the protests, soldiers in the military, the IDF has to understand they need to be statehood spirit oriented to avoid entering the political arena at any cost. That will preserve the situation and will manage to bring us to the purified moment of some kind of capability of agreeing with something. Ofer, do you believe that there is such a chance of reaching the statehoodness? Frankly, not really. To reach it, not to go back. So, no, frankly, look at that. In my eyes, a significant part of solution here is to look into the eyes of the problem and to figure out what is happening. And what actually happened here is, in fact, and I talked about the demons that were, the genies that emerged from the bottle, and they were being accumulated in this bottle for many years, not just by the government and the judicial overhaul. Those demons were in the bottle, and that was an act, I don't even know how to define that, whether it's an act of stupidity or evil or blindness, whatever you want to call it, of the lifting the lid of this bottle, but the demons were inside of it. I don't know, maybe, again, I do hope that people, and it did mention the younger generation. I don't see significant involvement of the younger generation. What is happening right now? Well, they are those who are dancing at Kaplan Street. This is not an involvement of young generation. What is happening right now? I don't see different language that is happening. Maybe it will emerge from there. Maybe we'll get scared a little bit, and that's what will birth the change. And there will be an actually quite panic discourse around our existence, but it will cause the discourse, and we'll understand that we're actually looking into the abyss, and we need to go back from the brink of this abyss. Can I tell you that I know how will it happen? No. Again, I would like to go back to the point. You do see that the general agenda of dialogue at the president's, well, there is a certain faction, and I'm always mentioning that when I talk to people that are within this dialogue, people from outside, they are really halved. They want to get to some kind of decisive decision. They own with their agenda, but there is an aspiration toward things to become normal again. So we need people that are within the room, within the political system, need to overcome this particular situation. Are they capable of that? Well, I will say it this way. I am not a prophet. Well, before we finish, by the way, we didn't talk about the economical situation. We didn't mention the Arabic world, the Arab population in Israel. 20% of the state of Israel population, which is also part of this narrative. And the police, we will mention that. We did touch just the tip of the iceberg of the general crisis, but I will try to actually round it up. Hopefully, I will not sound too naive. But as someone who actually is someone who is an alum of the peace talks, and I met people with different opinions from the right-wing map and the religious one. I'm a secular person, but again, we met as well in the president's house discussing various peaceful conversation processes. There's a bit of a demonization of both parties, of the other side of the rival. And I think that there is a complete lack of trust, not just in the political rank, but it's also lack of trust in everything who thinks differently from you. And I think maybe some kind of beginning among the younger generation, maybe adults, but again, maybe it's a little bit of agreement to listen and willingness to listen, not to attribute some kind of evil intentions to those who think differently. Maybe we all will start from this particular point, and maybe we can emerge from this crisis, or maybe not. But we do hope that we'll go through the Remembrance Day and the Day of Independence at peace, and people will, I just said, with internal and power, inbound and outbound, so we can unite as much as possible inwards, but also handle the external threats. So thank you, those of you who were listening and watched. Thank you for participation.